In our first lecture, I brought us from the medieval to the modern, showed how the various major kingdoms of Europe came to be, where the origins of capitalism, industrialization, humanism, and liberalism had their roots. Then, over the course of our second lecture, taking us through the French Revolutionary period, I illustrated how it was that this period, approximately 1789 to 1814, laid the groundwork for the fully industrialized, professionalized nation states of Europe that would, over the course of the next century, totally replace the old kingdoms cum empires we've seen develop up to this point. Today, we're going to pick up our story where we left off last. That is, the defeat of Napoleon and the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy to the throne of France. Specifically, we're going to start our lecture by talking about the attempt by the victorious coalition of powers, Great Britain, Russia, Austria, etc., to essentially reset the social, economic, and political board back up the way it had been before the French Revolution and Napoleon had come along and ruined everything. Now, as we'll see, people like Austrian Foreign Minister Metternich, I have to say it right, otherwise people will dog me, recognized that things couldn't be put back precisely the way they had been. Too much had changed. But at the Congress of Vienna in 1815, they were going insofar as possible to try and recreate Ancien Regime Europe. However, their efforts to hold that new old system in place would, after years of suppressed upheavals and false starts, ultimately be exploded by the revolutions of 1848, which we will close our discussion with today. Very fascinating stuff. Now, before getting into all this, I just want to remind everyone why it is we're doing this. Starting our seminar on 20th century European history with several lectures about events taking place a century or even several centuries prior. And that reason is that the results of World War II gave us the Cold War, which gave us the world we see today. And World War II was the result of World War I, which was the result of a series of intertwined processes in the 19th century that come together violently at the start of the 20th. And that these processes themselves grew out of the events of the French Revolution, which grew out of the events we talked about, etc., etc. What I'm telling you is a story, a general story of how it is that Europe finds itself tearing itself apart just at the moment it is apparently master of the globe at the beginning of the 20th century. And this context is, I think, critical to that understanding. So, while I understand there's a lot of information in these lectures, it is not critically important that you remember or know whom Napoleon defeated at Jena, so much as it is important to know that Napoleon's reorganization of the German states, which we'll actually get to talking about a little bit in our lecture today when we talk about the creation of a unified Germany, most of which will happen next time. But it was central to the process of German unification. And this was the result of the critical destabilization of the balance of power system agreed at Vienna in 1815. And this will all play and feature prominently in the run-up to World War I, of course, the creation of a unified Germany. Okay, one final note. For the next few lectures, our focus is on developing the themes we've been discussing, things like industrialization, liberalism, nationalism, in the context of those European states that are going to be central to the making of World War I. Now, this doesn't mean we're only going to be talking about the few great powers we've been talking about. Great Britain, France, Russia, etc. We will, of course, be talking about them, but much of our interest, especially next lecture, and then the lectures of week 3, are going to be on places like the disunified German and Italian states, the nationalities of the soon-to-be Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the fight for independence from the Ottoman Empire by the various peoples of the Balkans, especially the Serbs. So, for example, you really aren't going to hear much about Spain or Portugal for the next few weeks. I'll circle back around to talk about Spain and Portugal during our week of lectures on the interwar period in the 1930s, and we'll spend some amount of time on the Spanish Civil War. And this, in part, is a function of neither state having been really involved in the First World War, lucky for them, but perhaps even more so, they were kind of walled off from the rest of the continent by the Pyrenees. Spain and Portugal seem stuck in a kind of virtual time warp that sees little of the sustained progress in terms of industrialization, liberalism, or even mass nationalism for the next century. Really, much like Britain in the post-war period, they go through this period of their empire slipping away and struggling with both the material and psychological effects of this, constructing a new identity. And while this is all to make a gross generalization, that is something you have to do when trying to breeze through a century of history very quickly. 19th century Spain is great. Read a book about it, especially if you're a fan of pronunciamientos. All right, then, back to 1815 in the Congress of Vienna. What is it and what did it produce? Well, as I said in opening, the Congress of Vienna was an attempt by the victorious powers at the end of the Napoleonic Wars that aimed to put France back in its box and get all the old royal houses back on their feet, because boy, had that been a rough couple of decades. To do this, the representatives of Russia, Austria, Prussia, and Great Britain formed the Quadruple Alliance. This alliance was committed by its members to maintain mutual cooperation and consultation to address any challenges to the established order. That is, it was devoted to preserving the territorial settlement achieved at the Congress of Vienna and to act together to crush any potential resurgence of revolutionary or Napoleonic threats in Europe. The Quadruple Alliance played a crucial role in shaping the post-Napoleonic international system, excuse me, and contributed to the Concert of Europe, a diplomatic framework aimed at preventing major power conflicts and maintaining stability in Europe during the 19th century. The reason for this was that experience had seemed to show that wars followed revolutions, or that revolutions followed wars, and that the new kinds of wars that were being fought were highly dangerous to the old order, for all the reasons we talked about last week. And the further social disruptions they could produce at home were deemed equally dangerous, so best to just avoid war altogether. So, with much cooperation, surprisingly, for the next basically 4 decades until the Crimean War of 1853-56, there will not be a major war among all the powers. They'll instead all focus on keeping any discontented elements within their own polities suppressed, and even lending a helping hand to any monarchy whose situation looks like it's getting away from them, as would quickly happen, first of all, in Spain of all places, the 1820 liberal mutiny of Cadiz being put down with the help of forces sent by newly reconstructed Bourbon France. Of course, they were cousins. Which brings us to an important point. Even though France had been at the heart of all the trouble these past 20-odd years, they were granted a seat at the table in Vienna, and the plan was to get royalist France back on its feet and able to play its own part in maintaining the balance of power, which, as you can see from the previous example, they did. And much of this initial success is due to the person who became King of France when the Bourbons returned. And this was the younger brother of King Louis XVI, one of his younger brothers, the one who was executed during the French Revolution, 16. So Louis XVII. This Louis is Louis XVIII because Louis XVII, Louis XVI's son, basically dies of neglect during the Revolutionary period. So yes, okay. So King Louis the 18th, yes, King Louis XVIII. He dies, though, in 1824. And his brother, the Comte d'Artois, who I mentioned as being at the heart of the emigres who were causing trouble, and he was a total pain from the perspective of the pragmatist. He's basically your prototypical reactionary who refused to come to terms with anything that happened over the past 30 years. A constitution? Forget it. Hiring based on merit? Preposterous. The king answering to anyone? Just sacrilegious. Freedom of the press and assembly? Hang them all. You get it. That was Charles X, the last of the Bourbon line of kings. Actually, he's from the specific branches. The cadet branch will take over. But here I'm jumping a little bit ahead chronologically. But this quote is just so apropos regarding this tendency of Louis to fight these forces rather than like his brother who really just wants to make peace with these forces. I just wanted to share it with you here now. Sorry. It goes like this. If you march at the head of the ideas of your century, these ideas will follow and sustain you. If you march behind them, they will drag you with them. And if you march against them, they will overthrow you. So it's a great quote, and it's from Napoleon III, Louis Napoleon, little Napoleon, who will eventually become emperor after Charles and then Louis Philippe both get overthrown, and the Second French Republic is declared, which will happen later. So, anyway, back to the lecture. So, King Louis XVIII attempts to kind of fuse some elements of what had worked during the Napoleonic Empire with the elements of the old regime they wanted to put back in place. When he dies, his brother Charles X, his younger brother, the Comte d'Artois, who had been the really reactionary one, he essentially starts trying to, reclaim all the old properties and reestablish the Ancien regime for real, and he's quickly overthrown. He provokes a fight with the streets of Paris in 1830 and loses, and basically through a lot of backdoor maneuvering, very quickly, Louis Philippe, the Duc d'Orléans, gets the call. He had actually fought for the Revolutionary armies initially at, I believe it was Valmy. I don't have that right in front of me, but when he takes the crown, it's on the promise, allegedly, of it. There's a lot of dispute about that. A constitution based on what's called the Program of the Hotel de Ville, and he's basically takes the crown as the throne, as the king of the French, not the king of France. It's a subtle change, but it's indicative of the broader changes that are underway here. France is no longer the personal property of an individual monarch and their vassals, but it's the property in place of the people. Now, this is not a class about the political history of France, central to our story though it is. So I'm going to depart France momentarily, and we're going to do a quick sweep to see how the rest of the major powers are faring during the interval between the Congress of Vienna and 1814. So, right next door in Austria, Metternich is horrified by the overthrow of a legitimate monarch in Charles X, but Austria's situation is so financially strapped and tenuous internally, they can't really afford to do anything about it. Much like Louis XVI's government had been unable to do anything about Prussia bullying the fledgling Dutch Republic in the final years of his administration before the Revolution of 1789, I mentioned that briefly last week. The second thing, the Austrians see that the Republic has been avoided, and there's a new king, it's basically another burden. There's nothing really to panic about, especially as bad as things are internally. They can't really do anything because there were a lot of problems in the Austrian domains. Despite Metternich's efforts at reform, and no, he was not opposed to all reform. He just wanted them to be controlled top down and very limited, more or less imitating the absolute authority of the emperor. Even his mild suggestions were going to be stymied by just the fundamental inactivity and torpor of the system of centralized rule, in which the emperor of Austria is essentially wanting to make every decision personally. So by the 1820s, 1830s, there is a professionalized bureaucracy intended to run the empire, but the emperor is just micromanaging everything, resulting in really nothing getting done. And then he goes and dies, and his son, it's not entirely clear what was quite wrong with him, but he was physically handicapped in such a way that running the empire was just always totally out of the question. And the Regency Council that his father puts in place before he dies is a total disaster. Very divided, always quibbling about this and that. In short, nothing continues to get done. And so while Metternich at the foreign ministry is trying to keep the peace between the powers, something he'll actually be quite effective at doing, domestically, the ship is just kind of drifting straight toward the rocks of 1848. Remember, Austria has all those different nationalities. It's called the prison house of nations. It's got Slovenes, Croats, Hungarians. Those are the big ones to remember. To the north, meanwhile, in Prussia, the years 1815 to 1848 saw significant changes. Under the leadership of some key figures like Karl August von Hardenberg, there were major reforms in administration, education, legal system, the goal being to strengthen the state and enhance its military and economic capabilities. Political representation, like everything else and everywhere else, was limited, and so, also like everywhere else, tensions rose between conservative forces who resisted further liberalization and reformers who sought expanded political participation. Perhaps most importantly, for the future of German unification, the Zollverein was created. And this was a customs union formed in 1834, which helped facilitate economic cooperation among German states, with Prussia playing the lead role. The Austrians, the other major Germanic power, having wanted to remain outside this key trade zone for fear of its protected manufacturers, who were small and inefficient, being swamped, even though it was impossible for their own stunted industry to even come close to meeting existing demand, a problem that would literally never become better, relatively speaking. I'll just note this now, as it was true in France, Austria, and Prussia, though not necessarily true of Russia, which I'm going to move on here to in a moment. As we move toward 1848, urbanization and industrialization are going to be putting increasing pressure on the social and political order. And this is something I'll talk about more in the context of setting up for the revolutionary explosion when I walk us through a survey of the 1840s. A terrible decade, pretty much no matter how you want to look at it. The events of which basically caused the stress that I'm talking about now to become unbearable for these regimes. So in Russia, not a lot actually to say about developments in Russia during this period. Serfs will remain serfs. The Tsar will remain an autocrat in the truest sense. And the only hint of liberal revolutionary spirit brought back by the young officers who had spent time in Europe fighting Napoleon will be snuffed out without really any difficulty at all. This was the Decembrist Revolt of 1825, when a few thousand of these young officers were cut down after trying to seize upon the opportunity of the sudden death of the Tsar Alexander I. For all of its lack of political, economic, or social progress, this period is really a period of apparent Russian ascendancy. And I don't want to get too sidetracked here because much of this action is taking place outside of Europe and specifically in Central Asia. But just really quickly, Russia is expanding its territorial holdings and fighting for influence in places like modern-day Iran and Afghanistan, right there at the door to India. In fact, at one point, the two lines, the Russian and British, will only be a couple hundred miles away from each other at their nearest point. And this fear of Russia will drive a lot of British strategic decision-making during this period, such as deciding to fight the Russians over the issue of Crimea, something that we're actually just not even going to go into at all. I will return to Russia in the context of the build-up to World War I, picking up probably in the 1860s when the serfs are liberated by Tsar Alexander II, grandfather of Nicholas II, the last of the Tsars. For now, just know the Tsar is so secure and Russia so immune to revolutionary spirit at this point that the Russians are actually called in to put down the Hungarian uprising on behalf of the Austrians in 1848. I think it's actually 1848, 1849, 1850 by that point. But We'll see that when we get there. But we were just talking about Great Britain, so let's quickly conclude our trip around the great powers of the 19th century, having seen how they were faring in the years between the Congress of Vienna and Revolution. The old order having defeated Napoleon, trying desperately to hang on in the face of the mounting challenges of nationalization, nationalism, not nationalization, nationalism, industrialization, and liberalism. Now, like its great geopolitical rival, Russia, Great Britain is also relatively unaffected by the general uprisings of 1848. Unlike Russia, this isn't because there's almost no economic, social, or political development going on. In Great Britain, there very much is. In fact, it is the most rapidly industrializing state anywhere. However, and this is a lesson that goes back to the quote we looked at from the younger Napoleon, and that others on the continent should have taken note of, at least if they wanted to keep their thrones. Timely concessions. In the case of the British, you have the Reform Act of 1832, later known as the First Reform Act. And this aimed at addressing widespread corruption and expanding the right to vote. It increased the number of eligible voters, particularly in urban areas, by redistributing parliamentary seats. This combined with repeal of the later Corn Laws, the later repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846, were likely what made the difference with regard to revolutionary pressures in England being largely negligible during the period, because this lowered the cost of food and giving political rights. Which is a lot of what this is going to be about. And you'll see that here. The dreaded 1840s. Here we are. Now, you know that any period that is retrospectively remembered and called the quote-unquote hungry 40s is going to be rough. But it's the dual revolutions we talked about in our first week that are really going to make this truly and comprehensively catastrophic on multiple levels across multiple countries. So what's going on here? Well, if you look at the slide available on Blackboard, as always, this is lecture 3. I have a few of the causes enumerated, and I'm going to just dive into talking about them. First, though in no particular order, you have the failure of the potato crop. Not only does this drive millions of Irish to the shores of the United States, it causes food prices to rise everywhere on the continent, particularly once the bitter cold and rains of 46-47 combined to ruin a good amount of the wheat and barley harvest in places like France. So this is something to keep in mind. There was food. It was just really expensive, and it was expensive everywhere. Why? Well, speaking very broadly, the transportation and market revolutions of industrialization and economic liberalization were combining to make Europe into one great barrierless zone of commercial activity. Advances in shipping, steamers, railroads, etc., and a merchant class who are interested in taking their product outside areas of plenty to areas of scarcity where they can make greater profit. Arbitrage. Aloso and Williford talk about this in your reading. While this all seems perfectly right and good to us, although sometimes people do even today get upset about, quote unquote, gouging, this was an outrageous shock to essentially peasant populations of places like France and the German principalities. Food riots become very commonplace, and you were in danger of having your goods seized if you didn't sell your product at a, quote, fair price to those on the spot, these angry families who were demanding it. So on the one hand, you have everyone's budget increasingly devoted to food, and already that was by far the largest single outlay for most families. On top of this, and somewhat relatedly, you have people ceasing to buy manufactured goods. Now, the growth of urbanization with industrialization meant you had increasingly large amounts of people grouped together producing things you couldn't strictly subsist off of, but only exchange for money with which you could then use to buy the means of subsistence. Well, just like today, times get tough and you cut those on those less necessary expenses. What happens then? Well, it triggers a wider recession, and the economic crisis spills over into the growing industrial sectors, who then lay off workers and cut production in an effort to maintain prices. The credit markets, meanwhile, which though they are relatively developed, there are a lot of banks and central banks at this point. Credit grows very tight, very fast. Businesses aren't making money, and so they aren't paying back their loans, and so the banks aren't getting paid, and so they're calling in other loans. So rumors spark some bank runs. You get a credit crunch, basically. And the speculative mania surrounding things like Continental Railway shares and things these are just going to collapse. Just a quick note on how nationalism is also making things worse and how all of this is tied to the social and economic developments we've been discussing. People are moving all over the place, migrating in search of work, for example, and they're coming into contact with all these others. This is capital O, others. And this is forcing people to think about their own identities and place in the world in new ways, specifically for our purposes in terms of national identity, as Germans, as Italians, etc. So as you can see, by 1848, the various rulers of the kingdoms of Europe are facing an extremely difficult set of circumstances. The poor are unhappy because they're starving, there's no work. The growing middle and upper classes, meanwhile, the bourgeoisie, they're upset because they're being excluded from running things when clearly those in charge are doing a terrible job, while the conservatives don't want to see any change at all. All this led Alexis de Tocqueville of Democracy in America fame to rise in the Chamber of Deputies in the weeks before the revolution in France were to erupt in Paris to pronounce the following: "Gentlemen, I fear we are sleeping on a volcano. Indeed. The subsequent explosion is intense. The July monarchy is toppled. That's Louis Philippe's monarchy is toppled. The Second Republic is proclaimed in a matter of days. And because of improvements in transportation and communication, word spreads rapidly. And within 2 weeks, the crowned heads of the German states are metaphorically rolling. Metternich has been ousted, and the Hungarians, the largest of the ethnic minorities of the Habsburg Empire, are in open revolt. Taking a quick look at the slide there, you can see the rough timeline of events as well as a map illustrating their occurrence. However, within a year, everything is essentially apparently back to normal. What happened? Well, these revolutions result in the restabilization of the existing order for some fairly simple, if exceedingly complex reasons in their particulars. So, just basically, having used the power of the streets and the social revolutionaries to topple the small c conservatives, the liberals then smashed their former allies, literally wheeled in the artillery and blasted them to pieces in many cases. Look up if you've ever read Les Mis. For example, that scene is part of it. So having thus alienated themselves from their former supporters, who after all weren't interested in the revolution stopping at the enfranchising of those with property or education, the now isolated liberal class of lawyers, bankers, etc., they then get smashed in turn by the forces of counter-revolution, the old order reasserting itself with vigor. So basically, the social revolutionaries who are militating on the streets are betrayed and abandoned by those who had simply wanted a political revolution in like the salons and corridors of government, and so then they in turn are sort of counter revolutioned against. This is a recurring pattern, especially during the next couple of decades due to expansive economic growth. That is the period 1850-1870. This divide between social and political radicals. That is those essentially quote unquote respectable, moneyed, propertied, educated people who desire political rights and economic liberalization, and those who, whether they be students or urban workers, Marxist proletariat, they desire a revolution in the social order. We're talking about, small d Democrats and socialists and communists eventually. The former, the small L liberals, are going without exception to side with forces of order, that is the small c conservative establishment, in crushing the latter when it comes to the point. We see it time and time again. The quote unquote party of order. In fact, the only successful revolutions of the period will be those waged to throw off a foreign power, as in Italy or in the Balkans, and those will be affected by key members of the existing old order. So that's where we'll leave it at what more or less what one historian has called quote, the turning point at which Europe failed to turn. As we'll see in our lecture Monday of next week, which features the creation of a unified Germany and Italy, it wasn't the radical revolutionaries or liberal reformers who made those states. It was members of the ruling elite. Bismarck, a Prussian Junker, that is a great landowner, and Count Camillo Cavour of the Kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia. We'll see you then.